Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Wednesday, April 23rd, day 565 of the war. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazer Berman, joining us from our Jerusalem office. Hi, Lazer. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good morning. Good to be here.
Always so great to have you. And you've been away for a bit, so Lazer will update us on the status of the hostage release negotiations. And we'll hear about a phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night. We'll also learn about Washington's new ambassador to Israel and what he said when he was presenting his credentials. And we'll spend time in the second half of the program to discuss the legacy of Pope Francis vis-a-vis Israel and the Jews. All this and more when we're back. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke via phone yesterday with U.S. President Donald Trump, and the American leader said afterwards that the pair are, quote, on the same side of every issue. So to me, of course, the pressing issues are the direct Iran nuclear talks and the hostage release negotiations. But reports have varied after the conversation. At least initial reports were varied after the conversation about what exactly was the content. So, Lazer, can you fill us in on what you're hearing?
Sure. So this is the first phone call, or at least the first one that we know about, since that meeting in the Oval Office that I was at, in which President Trump somewhat ambushed Prime Minister Netanyahu, told him that there would be direct talks, quote unquote, with Iran on its nuclear program the coming Saturday, praised Turkish President Erdogan, and did not commit to ending tariffs. So this is the first time they spoke. I think it's curious that from the Israeli side, from Netanyahu's office, he usually boasts about these calls ahead of time and then releases something after and shows that he is the one who was so close to the American president and uniquely among world leaders, he has this relationship that he knows how to manage. That didn't happen beforehand. We were relying on leaks in other outlets initially to get word of this. When I dug around, I couldn't get any official. I had to rely on anonymous sourcing for this call. And also afterward, there was no readout afterward. The information I was able to get, which was late last night, was that the phone call was short. This is from the Israeli side, and that they did speak about the Iran nuclear program and the talks. Now, what was curious for a lot of people was that in Trump's Truth Social post, he did not mention that they had talked about the ongoing attempts to reach a hostage deal. And I couldn't find any information about it, though there was reporting afterward, again, citing anonymous officials, that they had indeed talked about it. And it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't talk about it. This is something that the U.S. administration wants. This is something that obviously Israel wants a certain deal, and they have been putting some muscle behind it. I would say diplomatically, but teams are working on it, and there is effort, and there's actually some optimism in conversations that I've had with officials yesterday. So I thought it was interesting that it wasn't discussed at all by Netanyahu. I think that shows something, that maybe he's being a little bit more cautious about his relationship with Trump and not getting ahead of himself. And also that they did not put out any updates or even any statement about whether they're optimistic or how they feel about hostage talks. So I think that is all. It could also be a good sign for hostage talks, by the way. It could mean that things are actually moving and things are delicate and they don't want to shake things up. And now the real work is there. But I don't think we're there yet, because Israel's senior negotiators have not been joining the talks in Cairo. They have their bags packed, I know, but that's just in general. But they have not been joining those talks. So I think we are a ways off still.
Okay, so let's drill into the hostage release negotiations. And this morning, we're hearing reports out of Saudi Arabia that Hamas is expected to propose a new ceasefire framework for Gaza. They're in Cairo, it appears. Hamas is already in Cairo. And let's talk about the specifics, but it appears to me, just looking at the broader picture, that the big change from the leaks that we're hearing out of Saudi Arabia and other outlets is that Hamas is now looking for a 5-year truce. and that the Gaza Strip would be run by this technocratic council that Egypt proposed several months ago, actually. So let's talk about this idea of a 5-year truce and a complete end to the war and a complete release of all the hostages for a certain number of Palestinian security detainees held in Israel. So this idea of a 5-year truce, is this new, or did I just not hear about it before?
So was certainly reported. I think it was 2 days ago from a report by the Qatari Al Arabi Al Jadid, which talked about a 5 to 7 year truce. So it looks, what I can interpret is this: Israel has its proposal that it presented, which is 40 something days. So let's call it 6 weeks, up to 45 days for 10 living hostages, which is basically the Witkoff bridging proposal. It looks like Israel's come down by a hostage. They were talking about half the living Israeli hostages, which is 11 out of 22. Now it looks like they're down to 10. Okay. So that's basically the same Israeli proposal. They're just trying to play with it a little bit. And let's not forget, this is combined with military pressure and the lack of humanitarian aid, which Israeli officials tell me is working. They say there are signs that it's working. There is pressure from the mediators on Hamas to accept something. Certainly Egypt wants this thing to end, and I'm told that America and Israel are very happy that Egypt is taking the lead on talks now and not Qatar. So Hamas has to do something. They publicly rejected on last Thursday the Israeli proposal, and now they have to put something forward. So the mediators put their own version forward, which is what was reported. Our own Jacob Magid had a report on what Hamas is willing to do with its weapons, which is they're willing to put them in storehouses for the period of this truce. And the mediators proposed this extended truce, which they, of course, hope will harden into something permanent. And now it looks like Hamas is getting ready to use that idea, but to give its own, try to pull its own direction a little bit. So a 5-year ceasefire, and this technocratic government that is supposed to run Gaza. Now, why does Hamas want this? One, it ends the war, which is what it's always wanted, so it can say that it survived and it won. Israel did not win or lost. This 5-year ceasefire, what do you think it's going to do? It's going to, sit there and, lament all the people it lost and sit there and study the religious text? No. Of course, it's going to understand the new reality, figure out ways to start rebuilding, reconstructing, figure out how far it can push the bounds of this ceasefire. And it's going to do what it always does. It is going to use creative and new ways to reconstitute its military force and to make things very uncomfortable for Israel. Maybe fire a rocket once in a while to show Israel that it is unhappy with something that Israel is doing. And in the meantime, it believes that Israel will be hamstrung because of these international guarantees from really doing anything. What could an international guarantee be? It could be a UN Security Council resolution that automatically imposes economic sanctions or weapons embargoes on Israel if Israel violates it. So this seems like something that would be quite advantageous for Hamas. And this technocratic government could be 20 to 30 people that have no real backing, that are, bureaucrats that know that if they get out of line, there's people with weapons and these are Hamas members and that's their threat. So that is not something that I imagine that Israel will accept. And I can see why Hamas is pushing this way. If the mediators are backing this idea as well, then, I don't think they're countries that we can trust to come up with a reasonable proposal by themselves, which means Israel has to be much more active in pushing something that meets Israel's needs, and but is also something that the mediators will press Hamas to accept. But let's not forget, ultimately, Hamas isn't going to accept something because the U.S., Qatar, or Iran is pressing them. This is life or death for the organization, and they'll only accept something if they think it will allow them to survive and in the future reconstitute.
The 5 years, of course, would put it outside the term of President Donald Trump, right? He will end his second term before the 5-year truce would be up.
He might be in his third term, don't forget.
Correct, right. If that amendment is repealed or a
Yeah.
new amendment is struck, of course, right. But you have to wonder if that was part of Hamas's calculations, because Donald Trump seems to be pretty consistent with his messaging that Hamas will not have a role in the day after in ruling the Gaza Strip. So it is a bit of a confusing conundrum here. Who exactly would be on this technocratic council, and how could it possibly be that Hamas would have no absolute sway? And as you pointed out, Laser, and this has always been confusing to me, I have wondered the whole time who is actually representing Israel in the mediation efforts, because it appears to me that Hamas is being represented, of course, by Hamas, and then the Qataris appear to be, at least to me, more on the side of Hamas, and Egypt as well has, in my opinion, sided more with the Hamas stance. So how much sway does the U.S. have in this negotiation table? Is there anyone else who is actually representing Israel here?
I don't think Israel really needs representation because they're ultimately the most powerful player here because they control what happens in the Gaza Strip and they're in the Gaza Strip. The U.S. has the dominant influence being the U.S. and the fact that they're the ones that can most effectively influence Israeli behavior. That gives the U.S. a ton of influence. Now, you can say that the Trump administration might be a bit distracted, even though this is a foreign policy priority, because you have Witkoff, who's their chief negotiator, dealing with the Iran file, which is a huge, complex file, which, let's be honest, he doesn't know all that much about. You have the Russia-Ukraine file, and then which is also Witkoff, and you have the tariff issue, which is a real. It's a landmark issue for Trump, for the Trump administration, and we're not. He hasn't decided where it's going to go. There's that 90-day pause. So, in terms of the ones that are really actively prioritizing this, I would say certainly Egypt first and foremost. They want this thing to end. They want it to end quickly. They want their economy to get back on track as much as possible. They want this violence on their borders to end. So, I think Egypt certainly really wants to see it done. And that's why they've been active in presenting, an alternative to Trump's Gaza Riviera program. But if they really want this to end, I think they're going to have to move a bit more in Israel's direction. And like you said, not be as in sync with some of these reported Hamas proposals for extended ceasefires, which we know is not going to work long term.
Okay, let's go to a short break, and then we're going to discuss the legacy of Pope Francis vis-a-vis the Jews and Israel. And we're back. Pope Francis died on Monday, which is a day after making his final public appearance in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday. And in his final message, he included a segment about the war in Gaza. And he said, and I quote, "I express my closeness to the sufferings of the Christians in Palestine and Israel and to all the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. I appeal to the warring parties, call a ceasefire, release the hostages, and come to the aid of a starving people that aspires to a future of peace." Now, Laser, this statement was extremely balanced, in my opinion, and really covered the suffering of both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. And I wonder, do you think for Israelis and Jews at large that it may help remove an uncomfortable relationship that Jews and Israelis have been experiencing with Pope Francis since the October 7th Hamas-led massacre of 1,200 in Israel?
Short answer, no. I think his recent, or say the statements and the positions since October 7th, I think have permanently altered the way, especially Israelis, but also Jews, will remember this Pope. So if we go back, the Catholic Church under his Pope Francis's two predecessors, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, made important strides in relations with the Jewish people. Some piece of this is the Israeli state in general, but those are two distinct issues. But certainly with the Jewish people, there's no question that Pope Francis saw himself as a continuation of this and did continue it. Right, so he was a pope that grew up with a lot of knowledge of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires. developed deep relationships with Rabbi Abraham Skorka, with other rabbis, visited synagogues. So he was part of that legacy. And then he made some important statements as well. He visited Israel in 2014, and really paid a lot of attention to what happens here. He elevated the Patriarch of Jerusalem to cardinal. I think that says something as well. And certainly with October 7th was very, kept a close eye on what was happening here and weighed in a lot. The criticism is twofold. First of all, purely on the Jewish-Catholic relations, he was initially seen as somewhat sloppy in the language he used. And it's a fraught issue where you really have to be very precise. And his two predecessors, these European academics were very precise with their language. And he wasn't. It was a sloppiness which Jewish organizations asked for him to be more careful about. And he really did not change the way he spoke about, Pharisees and spoke in the way he used some very problematic passages from the New Testament. On Israel, he, in his statements, especially right after October 7th, did not specifically single out Hamas as the perpetrator and focused on this idea of human suffering, which is an important element, but it's not the only element. If you're only talking about the suffering of civilians in Gaza, of which there is, of course, a lot of suffering, and of the hostages, you're missing some of the way this registers for Jews, that this is reminiscent of the Holocaust, that this is, again, pogroms, that this is a murderous organization, that we have to defend ourselves against, and sometimes that will mean in war, and Catholic just war theory recognizes this, civilians will suffer on the other side in a just war. And he did not seem to want to recognize that, and seemed to be suggesting that all wars, there's no just war. Just war theory is theoretical, and in practice, you cannot have a just war. And we as Jews know that some wars could not be more just, including the fight against evil, the fight against the Nazis, let's say, or the fight to establish the state of Israel. And I think there was a sense there that he really didn't get deep in his DNA what our fears were and what our concerns were. And there are experts who say, well, he did not grow up. He's the last pope that will have been alive during the Holocaust. But he was not someone who grew up and personally witnessed the Holocaust like the two previous popes did. And maybe that's a reason why he didn't register how deeply unsettled we can be and how concerned we are about threats to not only our safety, but to our existence. So I think that will last, and that will be part of his legacy. And I think that if you'd asked him, I think it would surprise him. He'd say, of course, I'm a friend to the Jews, to the Jewish people, and look at all these statements I've made. But I think ultimately he will be remembered as someone who did not live up to his own vision of where he stands with the Jewish people. And we can be concerned a little bit about the future because the church isn't going to go back, right? It's not going to go back on the Second Vatican, on Nostra Aetate. The ties will continue to move forward. But if indeed a pope from Latin America or Africa or Asia, where the center of the church is now, becomes the next pope, it might be a pope who lives in a place where there's no Jewish community and really has not thought about or has not prioritized Jewish-Catholic relations. So that's an issue. But then again, it could be someone like the Latin patriarch Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who is a fluent Hebrew speaker, who's lived here for more than 3 decades, who really is a wonderful man and really gets Israel and Jews. So it could go a number of directions, but that's something to look out for as the conclave convenes in early May.
So let's talk about the cardinal in the Latin patriarch, who is, as you said, now a cardinal a little bit more. And after October 7th, he, of course, very memorably suggested that he replace all the hostages, all the Israeli and the Thai hostages in Gaza, that he would swap himself for the hostages, which is just an incredible statement. Obviously, that didn't happen. But tell us slightly more about him and the process itself, because if I'm understanding you properly, there's an age cap, meaning it has to be a cardinal, right, who's 70 and under. Is that the situation? Who can be a candidate to have the white smoke come from the chimney eventually in Rome?
It has to be 80 and under.
80 in it. Okay, fine. So in his 70s. And so Pizzaballa, he's been here for 3 decades. How old is he?
On Monday, he turned 60.
So he would be a very young pope, actually, if he were elected. And
Yeah.
do you think he actually is a strong candidate? Is it possible that he would be elected?
The logic in moving in his direction would be to have to go back to having an Italian pope. The last three have not been Italians, and Italians is the more traditional choice. And so, if there is a desire to move in a somewhat more traditional direction after some of the upheavals in the Pope Francis tenure, then that could be a reason. But there's other kind of more likely candidates. Although there's this idea that the likely candidates never become ultimately the Pope, and it's often a dark horse candidate. So he is something that could be attractive. Obviously, being the Pope's representative in the Holy Land, especially at this time, is a very significant position. He's a Franciscan. He was the custos of the custody of the Holy Land, the Franciscans in this part of the Middle East. So a significant individual, speaks fluent English, obviously speaks Italian, speaks decent Arabic, speaks Hebrew. I think it would be a very interesting choice. But in terms of the internal politics and the back and forth there, in terms of what happens in the room and what happens in terms of these internal coalitions of different groups of cardinals, it's hard to say, and no one can really say. But again, there is this idea that the focus of the church in terms of its communities has moved from Europe and North America to places like South America and Africa. And at some point, popes are going to have to represent that. Pope Francis was the first Latin American pope, so we might see one from elsewhere. There's a very strong candidate from the Philippines as well. So that's what we'll have to see. But again, something to keep our eye on. And the patriarch is someone that I've met with multiple times and have always been impressed with him. So if he is selected, I think that would be a very interesting choice, and will do good things for relations between Israel and the Catholic Church and the Jewish world and the Catholic Church.
Okay, just very briefly to end off our program, let's talk about another new person filling a role, and that's, of course, Mike Huckabee, who is the new ambassador of the U.S. to Israel, and he presented his credentials, I believe it was this week, to President Isaac Herzog, yes, on Monday, according to my notes. And he said some statements that, just to bring our program full circle, which perhaps eased the minds of some of Israeli officialdom in relation to Iran and the U.S.'s stance on Iran. So, Laser, just briefly, what is the buzz about Mike Huckabee upon his arrival?
So he said exactly what Israel would have wanted to hear from a U.S. ambassador, which is that the main enemy of Iran is the United States. He said that Israel is the appetizer and the United States is the main course. And that is the way Israel and Netanyahu himself have presented the issue, that it's not just a threat to Israel, that America has to see this as indeed a threat to their own national security. And that was kind of the headline to come out of his prepared statements. And there are very serious Iran hawks at senior positions in the Trump administration. So Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Huckabee. It's just a question of how much influence he will have. This administration, Trump administration, the main focus of power right now is Mar-a-Lago, where he has his associates and a lot of his New York real estate people. It's a question of how much the foreign policy professionals and people like Huckabee will have influence, but it's good that he is in that position. Certainly, he and his wife, deep Zionists, lovers of Israel, lovers of the relationship between the U.S. Israel. So I think he said everything that supporters of Israel in the U.S. would want to hear, and also that the Israeli government and Israelis want to hear.
Laser, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.